Oftentimes, when a new set comes out, you might scroll through all the cards and find something to add to your deck. Maybe some new recursive creature for your Aristocrats deck, a big instant or sorcery for your spell copy deck, or just some utility creature that puts counters on itself for your +1/+1 counters deck. A lot of commander decks will care about fundamental parts of the game: enters effects, death triggers, a common card type. And because of that, those decks are constantly evolving and changing. You get new tools and toys from almost every set. And if you don't end up adding these to your deck, it was at least a new option to consider. But some decks don't do this as much. Their themes are tied to a unique mechanic or a card type that rarely shows up. And these decks don't change very often at all. I call these dead-end decks. The type of EDH deck you might not be able to upgrade in a meaningful way for years. But before I talk more about that, if you want to upgrade your commander deck, check out Cool Stuff Inc. If you use code TTM to get a discount, it also supports the channel. Thanks to Cool Stuff Inc. for sponsoring the video. There's a concept in Magic called a parasitic mechanic. Lead designer Mark Rosewater describes parasitic mechanics as: a parasitic mechanic is one that is only useful in the set it is in, which he separates from another key term, a linear mechanic. A linear mechanic is one that encourages you to put other types of cards in the deck with it. And then he gives an example of each. For example, Samurai tribal cards in Kamigawa block were parasitic because it's the only set to ever have samurais, while elf tribal cards in Lorwyn block were not, as the game had lots of elves already. I think the wording here is a little bit confusing when he's talking about linear mechanics, so I want to bring up what he says later. Can something be parasitic and not linear? Yes. The best example is sideboard cards created for a specific environment, like Melira Sylvan Outcast from New Phyrexia. This card has no place outside of that environment that it was created in, but it is not linear because it does not push you to add more specific cards to your deck. Unlike the elf deck, which is linear because it wants you to play more elf cards, even though there are many elves from many different sets. To clarify further, Mark Rosewater, in another post, talks about cycling as being not parasitic, but very linear, saying cycling is a very non-parasitic mechanic. You can easily throw a cycling card in any deck with full mechanical utility, but Astral Slide and Lightning Rift, as well as many other cards, exist. Those cards encourage you to play a lot of cycling cards in one deck, but it doesn't make that mechanic parasitic. Yes, we'll make cards that encourage you to play a lot of the same mechanic in a deck, and that might even be a tournament viable strategy. None of that makes it parasitic though. So a cycling deck is somewhat linear in the sense that you need many cycling cards to have it function, but there are lots of cycling cards from many sets, causing it to not be parasitic, and cycling does function and play well with other mechanics and themes. Since you are discarding a card, maybe you want to recur it to hand, it has other synergies with other things. Focusing back in on Commander, what if you built a deck around one of these parasitic or linear mechanics? Marina Vendrill is a great example. She lets you add any enchantment to hand with her first ability, which is great, but her activated ability really only works for rooms, which is a card type only in Duskmourn. And unless we get another house-themed sets, these 28 rooms are all you have to work with, making this commander both parasitic, because it only cares about stuff from one set, and linear, because you want to play a lot of the same thing. The same can be said about the ring tempting you. This is a goofy Lord of the Rings mechanic that buffs a ring bearer and wants you to be tempted by the ring, which also had nothing to do with the One Ring card. It's a very strange mechanic. And it's parasitic. There's really only one set that cares about this, and arguably even more linear than rooms, because rooms are enchantments you can pair with other enchantment synergy cards, whereas the One Ring tempting you is its own thing. You can't proliferate ring counters. There's no other support in the game that affects the ring. There are also a few commanders that I feel fall into the dead-end category without being tied to a specific mechanic. Those two examples were parasitic. Gumball Gremlin Prodigy is not parasitic, but is linear. Gimbal cares about creating artifact tokens with unique names. For example, on EDH Rec, we see over 50% of Gimbal decks using Toggo Goblin Weaponsmith, because he is the only card that makes rock artifact tokens. Or Sevella, who makes icy monoliths, and so on. Because of this, Gimbal decks have a lot of overlap and are very linear in that sense, where you just want to do a lot of the same thing. Create artifact tokens of a unique name. Until they print a new artifact token name, which is somewhat rare, you don't really have something to swap out your Toggo for. It's kind of the only option you have for rock tokens, or at least that slot of a unique artifact name. And there are tons of other commanders that call for a specific thing which doesn't show up often. I would consider all of these to be dead-end commanders. Commanders that are very difficult to meaningfully upgrade. Now, looking at these commanders can help us evaluate new mechanics as they come up. Let's compare these to max speed from Aether Drift. If you haven't seen the speed mechanic yet, basically when you play a Start Your Engines card, your speed becomes 1. And then whenever an opponent loses life during your turn, if your speed is 1 or greater, it increases by 1. Max speed is 4, only triggers once each turn. So you start your engines, you want your opponent to lose life during your turn, and you hit max speed. Then many of the Start Your Engines cards do something extra if you have max speed, or they care about what your speed is. So this is a parasitic mechanic. If you play a Start Your Engines themed commander deck, all of your payoffs and Start Your Engine cards are from one set. But is it linear? I think not, because you just need life loss to trigger speed, and the payoff could be in the command zone. I think the Speed Demon is a fine example of this. It is parasitic, but not linear. You just draw cards based on your speed. So all you need to do is play some way to cause your opponents to lose life, meaning aristocrats, aggro, or suiting up the demon itself. You can use almost any theme you want in the 99 and get value from the commander, because it just draws cards, which is good in almost any deck. So a lack of linearity can make a deck feel less one note, even if it's a parasitic mechanic. So if you're building the Speed Demon as an Aristocrats deck, you're probably going to, over time, find many ways to upgrade and change the list, as they print new sack fodder, or sack outlets, or creatures with death triggers, yada yada. But what about a more linear deck, like Lindy Cheerful Tormentor? This is technically not parasitic, because there are multiple sets that have curses, but it is very linear. You really need cards of a specific type to have this commander, well, do anything. And it doesn't help that a lot of enchantment synergy cards are in green and white, which means upgrading your list is mostly going to come from changes to the removal package, card draw, or other utility you might be playing, which is often going to be an off-theme card since curses don't have that much synergy, and you're unlikely to find a new curse board wipe in Tarkir. Additionally, if your removal package is either already some of the best-in-class cards or good budget alternatives, then it's unlikely you're going to find anything new to put in your curse deck anytime soon. But is this a bad thing? For me, as a mega nerd who's always brewing new decks and tuning my lists, I tend to avoid linear decks like this. For someone else though, that might be a plus. Think about it, you can build a Lindy curse deck today, and for the next 3 years, a curse might not get printed. And unless they print Super Cyclonic Rift, your support cards don't need to be upgraded either. You now have a deck that you can keep around for a long time without having to stay up to date with spoilers or buy new cards until we go back to Innistrad. And then after lying in wait for years, it will finally hit and you're going to get a bunch of new things to upgrade your deck with if you want. Before I move on to my conclusion here, I just wanted to shout out this Draftism article. When I was looking around for old Mark Rosewater posts, this article helped me find some of them, and it's a pretty good little piece about parasitic mechanics. Check it out, link in the description. So we now have this idea of a parasitic mechanic and a linear mechanic. Dead-end decks that are difficult to make meaningful changes to. But a parasitic mechanic doesn't always mean your deck can't have changes made to it. And like I said, if you're a brewer who wants to make lots of changes to their decks, try to avoid linear lists. Try to find commanders, themes, mechanics that play nice with other themes and mechanics so you constantly have this influx of new exciting tools for your deck. But if you don't want to do that, try to find a linear commander. A commander that really wants a specific thing. Sometimes that is a parasitic mechanic, like rooms or a almost parasitic mechanic like shrines, but it can be anything that just cares about something really specific that doesn't get printed often. If you're doing the 32 deck challenge, try adding some of these to your list to have less decks to upgrade. So let me know what you think about dead-end commanders. Do you like not having to change your list up often? Does that bore you? And tell me some of your favorite linear or non-linear commanders in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Special thanks to my patrons who make these videos possible. If you want to join the Patreon, get in the Discord, the credits, or the Patreon deck reviews, check out the link below.